This lecture looks at the events that happen after the fall of the Second Empire leading to the Impressionist exhibitions in the later 1870s, specifically with the fall of the Second Empire and Napoleon III. We have the French Commune set up, and then the Third Republic. The events leading to the Paris Commune are also the same that lead to the unification of Germany, which was the brainchild of Otto von Bismarck, who is the Prussian chancellor at the time, and he knows if he has a common enemy in France, he can unite the various German states together. So what he does is provoke France to declare war on Prussia, who then gathers its allies together to attack France. The reason why the French took the bait is that they were worried a unified Germany would undermine their dominance in Europe established with Napoleon. So Napoleon III declares war on July 14, 1870. Thus begins the Franco-Prussian War, which lasts less than a year. The French army are swiftly beaten at Sedan, the German border. Napoleon III is henceforth captured, and the Second Empire collapses. What is put in its place is the Third Republic that will last from 1870 until the Nazis overthrow it in 1940. But there was one holdout in France. The Parisians refused to surrender to the Germans, and so the Germans laid siege to the city. Now, while suffering, the rest of France is going to elect a provisional government of national defense at Versailles and made peace with Germany. The Parisians, on the other hand, felt betrayed and refused to recognize this new government. They refused to surrender. Instead, they set up what is known as the Paris Commune, an independent city-state within the country, much like you would have the Vatican City as an independent city-state inside of Rome and Italy. So on May 21st, 1871, government troops finally entered the city. French troops entered the city themselves, and thus followed the Bloody Week, where 25,000 insurrectionists were killed and the Commune was put down and eliminated. Now, the American Civil War, only a few years earlier, had documented these events, the deaths of civilians and of soldiers. The Paris Commune and its suppression were also thus documented by amateur and professional photographers. The communards, or those that were defending the city, led by Gustave Courbet no less, were, in the meantime, before they were overthrown, toppling hated symbols of imperial power. Thus, they wanted to erase the memory of Napoleon and his nephew Napoleon III. So they're going to push down the Vendôme column for starters. Here we have an anonymous amateur photographer taking a photograph of the fallen Vendôme column from 1871. Much like later hated imperial statues that represent oppression, such as that of Saddam Hussein in 2003, they were taking out their anger and frustration of the previous administration on images and symbols of it. Here we have the stiff frontality of the group portrait format contrasting the erect communards in the prostrate statue that is going to be laying horizontally in the image. So we have a very interesting photograph. Now, the message here is one of eradicating imperialism and thus establishing a modern democratic republic. Likewise, we have similar documentation and the aftermath of the Paris Commune with André-Alphonse Eugène Dizardy, who's going to, in his Cadavers of the Insurgents of 1871, document those that were killed after the Commune was disbanded. So here the communards are going to bury them after a mass execution that was ordered by the French government in Versailles. So we have the different elements of the Commune seen together, its triumph and its aftermath. Now, Dizardy is going to be in the tradition of documenting the horrors of war, much like we saw with Francisco Goya and Honoré Daumier. Both examples here are going to show the massacre of innocents. In this instance, these were combatants and insurgents, but the tradition is similar. This is going to anticipate modern photojournalism and record events of the day for posterity. We also have a record of what happens to Paris itself and its infrastructure and buildings. Auguste Bruno Braquet is going to take a photograph, for instance, of the Hôtel de Ville in 1871. These major buildings and thoroughfares were completely burned out and destroyed, this being the Town Hall of Paris that we looked at earlier in paintings on the great battles that we talked about in France. Now, the effects of war, recording these destructions of cities, is what photography will be used for, especially in World War I and II, showing how devastating the impact of such aggression has been. Now, what is interesting is these are not for newspapers or magazines because they have not yet invented a halftone process to be able to convert photographs for widespread distribution. Instead, these series would have been sold in shops or in albums individually printed. Therefore, we have a city in ruins and the Commune destroying Paris in order to hold on to its autonomy. Therefore, with its overthrow, the French government is very unstable, with opposing factions on each side of the Royalists and the Republicans. So the Third Republic that is set up in the aftermath of the Commune survives because the Republicans, that being those that favor democracy, are going to steer a very conservative line with the new slogan of moral order. In order to stabilize the very fragile situation and France itself, 40,000 people were arrested as part of the Commune. 10,000 were executed or deported to penal colonies in North Africa. They then turned their attention to reconstructing buildings and monuments that the communards had destroyed, such as re-erecting the Vendôme column, a symbol at the time for moral order and stability. By the 1870s, we find Paris is largely rebuilt, and the Third Republic has a firm foothold on the country and government. The Republican Constitution is ratified, and they even win a majority in the Senate. So the next stage is the artistic endorsement of this new republic, and to commemorate the tragic events that took place in the Commune and the Franco-Prussian War between 1870 and 71. One of these early projects commemorating these events would be an allegory of defense that would honor the Parisians for defending the city against the Prussians. There were 100 sculptors that competed for this prize. One of them was the young Auguste Rodin, who would become the most important modernist sculptor at the end of the century. Here we have his The Defense, or Call to Arms, from 1879 to 80. He submitted a plaster cast of his model and what the design would look like, with a winged figure of defense with a Phrygian bonnet, on top of a nude wounded soldier, urging him not to give up the fight, though he be wounded. Now, this is a mixture of different allegories, including that of liberty, France, and victory. So we have a winged figure wearing the Phrygian bonnet that we talked about with liberty with Eugene Delacroix, while combining these various elements together. Now, this is in the romantic tradition of François Rude and Carpeaux, whereby we have figures that are very activated and dynamic, and with their mouths open, screaming, dancing, and moving. But it is less detailed than these earlier versions, and it activates more of the three-dimensional space surrounding it, as the figures spiral upward in the counterclockwise fashion here, from the soldier who looks up to, once again, the allegory of defense above, who spreads her wings and arms out. This should remind one of Mannerist sculpture, and especially that of Jean Bologna's Rape of the Sabine Women, whereby we have the same type of twisting and activation of space. The focus here is the timeless energy and spirit of the figure shown, the allegory and the soldier. And because they are nude, it is timeless. It is not tied to a particular region, nationality, or tradition. But that is also the problem, and that's why it is not chosen in the end out of the 100 sculptors that submit, because it is generic and not specific. It does not really tie specifically to the Franco-Prussian War. The jury instead would choose that of Louis Ernst Barré in his defense of Paris. Now, this is an allegorical figure not of liberty or defense, but instead of Paris itself. Cities are often shown allegorically, as we've discussed, as women, often with a turret on their head here. So here we have a costume of a contemporary French civil guard and the soldier. So the city towers above, much larger than the man who she is encouraging to defend her. Now he continues to load his rifle in defiance. So the specificity and the realism are suitable for the commemorative purpose for which it serves, that being a specific event in a particular period of French history and relating specifically to the city of France. But Rodin's approach here will become very important as we move further into modernism. The second major competition was actually a multi-figural monument to the Republic, with 78 submissions for it. Now, few actually voted for the winner, Jules Dalou, and his Triumph of the Republic, but he had the support of government. So here we're going to have the center for the Place de la Nation, or Nation Square, and in it we have another triumph of this new government. It centers on the figure of the Republic itself, this new government, again commonly wearing the Phrygian cap and holding the fasces, the symbol of power of the lictors in ancient Rome. We find that the official seal is going to carry on this tradition, both of the female allegory with the Phrygian bonnet and the symbol of power, this axe that she holds. We find here she stands on a globe that rests on this chariot pulled by two lions, representing the strength of the people and not the monarchy at this point, led by a boy with a torch raised above his head. We have additional allegories of labor, justice, and abundance, or peace, surrounding the lower section, showing the effects of this government, showing that it is to the benefit of all, because justice is going to lead to peace and prosperity. Now, this shows us the direction of sculpture moving forward, which abandons the classical forms that are quite static, such as Prodier's victory figure we talked about in the tomb of Napoleon. Instead, it will take its cue from Baroque conceptions, much like Rubens, whereby we have a pile of figures leading upward in an ascension to the culminating figure, the most significant one above. So instead of Christ or the Virgin Mary, we now have the allegory of the Republic itself. Turning back time to the Second Empire, we have at this time Republicans wishing to give a gift, celebrating a century of friendship between the United States and France. Therefore, at the time, fundraising began after the Commune in the Third Republic to continue this massive commission, which was given to Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, who was a sculptor with experience on classical and colossal monuments. Now, they chose Bedloe's Island, or Liberty Island in New York Harbor, as the place the statue would be seen, as it was the most visible from the harbor and the surrounding city of Manhattan. This simple dramatic form that can be seen here with Liberty enlightening the world, now known better as the Statue of Liberty, would have the silhouette easily seen from the decks of ships that would approach from New York and New Jersey. It is not cast in bronze, but instead uses a new industrial method with beaten copper sheets that are riveted together, attached with iron braces to a central skeleton, or scaffolding, if you will. Here is the interior showing these various rivets and plates that were assembled together on site after being shipped to America. It was actually executed in Paris and then dismantled to make it more possible and easier to ship. Now, the technical advisors on the project had much experience with, say, bridges and other large public work projects, specifically Viollet-le-Duc and Gustave Eiffel, who will later work on the Eiffel Tower. Now, it arrived in 214 crates in New York as they then disassembled everything and prepared to put it together. The problem, of course, was the pedestal. Here's the construction of the largest concrete structure in the world at the time, a massive, massive undertaking that they had to come up with a solution for. Now, here we find that the design by Bartholdi would have Liberty with a spiked helmet, torch, and tablet with the date of the Declaration of Independence on it, 1776. Now, this is not the traditional type of liberty that French artists, artisans, and sculptors had been working with. They replaced the Phrygian bonnet, for instance, with this spiked crown, if you will, because of the American dislike and uncomfortable associations of slavery and the French revolutionary radicalism that went along with it that made Americans also uncomfortable. It is actually designed after the Colossus of Rhodes, or the statue of Helios, the sun god. Thus, enlightenment is seen in the sun-spiked helmet, light illuminating the world here. That is reinforced with the item of the torch that she holds. The position is also significant as it faces Europe, so America is meant to be seen as a shining beacon of freedom to the entire world. But it was not until 1883 that we have Emma Lazarus writing the poem New Colossus that people so remember and associate with the statue. As, of course, she writes, "Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." Turning to academic art, there was a crisis at the time in state-sponsored salons that led to their demise in 1880. The problem of the salon is as follows. Its role is confusing, especially since the Commune in 1870. Is it a marketplace to sell works, or is it merely an exhibition of French patrimony? Who should actually jury and judge who gets in? What specifically is the salon? The government then turned over control of the salons to artists themselves, specifically the Society of French Artists that held control from 1881 to 89. But they were just as conservative and repressive as the previous generation. So this leads to the founding of the Society of Independent Artists in 1884. This lasts for 10 years in its existence, and the official salon would attract record visitors in 1874 of nearly 500,000 in 6 weeks alone. From 1870s to the 1880s, the salon was still a vehicle regardless of gaining exposure for artists. One of the most celebrated of these artists would be William Bouguereau, who is going to have a very polished and academic style of painting, but it has a seductive prettiness that also made his work very popular and beloved with American collectors. So this is a popularizing of academic art, if you will. Here we have his young girl defending herself against Eros of 1880. And in the painting, we of course have the seductive nudity of a young woman, along with Cupid here, who is teasing at stabbing her with his arrow as she will then fall in love. Cupid, remember, is an allegory of masculine libido, though masked here in a prettiness, in an unpretentious and an unthreatening way. It's not overtly sexualized, but the message is still clear, so it's a safe way to navigate these themes of eroticism, which of course was what the public liked. Now here we do not see the young woman actually struggling against Cupid with any type of conviction. She is playfully and coyly playing with him and showing off at the same time her nude form, as she, with her posture, is not covering up and or is embarrassed, but instead is going to focus on, with Bouguereau in general, her soft, pretty, relaxed form. So this is in the tradition of finely painted and meticulously crafted works of Jean-Léon Gérôme, who also was going to be popular with paintings like Pygmalion and Galatea at the salons, whereby we have the same type of subtle eroticism. It's not overtly sexual, therefore it's appropriate as it is seen to a wide audience. Now, Jules Breton is quite different. Here we see the popularization of realism. So we take the subjects that were popularized by Millet and Courbet, and now in the 1870s and 80s, they become more sentimental and popular with the public. We soften the harsh presentation, in other words. An example of that can be seen here with the Song of the Lark, which shows a young peasant girl on her way to work in the early morning as the sun rises. She looks up to the sky, listening to the song of a skylark seen above her here. So it is more as though an allegory for the awakening of the beauty of the world than on the harsh labor and conditions that this woman would face. Looking at earlier examples, such as the woman we talked about with the Rücken figure of Friedrich's example, we have something that is more than just the toil of manual labor. It is about the significance of sunrises and sunsets and beauty of creation, if you will, here. And if we look at a detail of her, we can also see that the toil that she is going to undertake has not really affected her presentation. We have a pretty idealized kind of aesthetic here for this rustic presentation of a peasant. She is shown as quite beautiful in many ways. So the bourgeois public, right, thinks of these lower classes as being contented with the little pleasures in life, and this merely reinforces that belief, much like the recall of the gleaners we talked about. The large heroic figures of the women do not really show how backbreaking the labor is or invite pity. Instead, we're meant to imagine our lives being much simpler and how nice it would be to have their lives. Another example that moves in a different direction is by Jules Bastien Lepage, who was a student of Alexandre Cabanel, which we will talk about again here shortly. And so we find that his technical procedure relating to academic painting is going to lead a new direction from realism. He revives realism, but now in the new direction of naturalism, we remove any political or sentimental overtones, as was seen in Courbet, Millet, and even Breton. It is devoid of overt references to past art and relies instead on direct observation, but of stage scenes. It differs radically from Impressionism because it prefers fine finish and detail as opposed to leaving things suggestive and sketchy. An example can be seen here with his Haymakers of 1878, whereby we have a peasant couple resting after the midday that they have eaten here their lunch, the soup at the woman's feet. The man is now asleep, but the woman is going to be dazed or waking up from her nap and stares vacantly off in the distance. Now this is very different from the Stonebreakers, as it has a fresh tonality and seems to be painted en plein air, as the light and color seem to be truer to life and nature. The meticulous finish seen in details has a type of photographic effect. And remember that artists, since the advent of photography, would often be accused of working from photographs, which was absolutely true in many instances, and when they did, they would often destroy the evidence so as to ensure it looks like they painted it themselves from observation. Now, many, of course, did use that, but they used it usually for a composition or drawing. Remember that photographs at the time still had no color. Therefore, they could not rely on the effects of light and atmosphere. They could only use it for compositional purposes and placing figures within a specific place on the canvas. Another example comes by way of his Joan of Arc Listening to the Voices of 1879, which has an ambiguous position as we're bringing together realism in the observation of nature with history painting. Now, it is topical because in the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans annexed Lorraine, which was the region of Joan of Arc's birthplace. Here we find that she's not in full armor, but instead shown as a peasant girl receiving a divine message behind her parents' cottage. So unlike the juste milieu approach of Marie, Princess d'Orléans, the saintly voices are actually manifesting themselves in the background. You can see them here with Saint Michael and Margaret, and Catherine even. Three of them can be seen, speaking to her. So this was criticized for combining these elements of fantasy with reality. And it also, if you look carefully, combines finished areas with loose brushwork. So again, it doesn't fit clearly into one genre or another, but does reflect the interest in naturalism in this movement. Now we know, turning to Edouard Manet, that he had abandoned his shocking subject matter in the 1870s, but he was still criticized, specifically for how he presented scenes of contemporary urban life. Here in his Railroad of the Gare Saint-Lazare of 1873, we have a good example of the type of composition and subject that the Impressionists would adopt in their exhibitions. Here we have urban dwellers, city folk, who are dressed in period attire. One is of a young woman holding a puppy and a book, seated looking at us to the left, whereas a little girl in a dress looks at the railway station and the smoke coming out of the trains right to the right. Now, it is an off-axis subject that is very loosely and in a sketchy fashion brushed in. The viewer is much like a passerby as we momentarily glimpse or catch the eye of this woman instead of a prolonged interaction or engagement. This is a fleeting moment in time. What is interesting, of course, here is how subtle and ambiguous the scene is compared to his Les Déjeuners sous l'herbe. Whereas we do not have a blatantly offensive scene. They are not nude. We are not suggesting anything tawdry is happening here. It is still startling because it is devoid of, say, beauty or sentimentality and even narrative. There is no story to be seen here. It's not one of agriculture. It's not people and technology. And we do not even know, very importantly, which is why critics call this unintelligible, if the woman and the girl even belong together. So is this her sister, her mother? Is her mother off, once again, camera as it were, and we cannot see her? What is our relationship to them? Critics had no way to actually discuss this. It defies genres. Continuing this interest in disjuncture and using japonisme as a compositional device, we have Edouard Manet in his Bar at the Folies Bergère, which he exhibits with the Impressionists in 1882, where we find ourselves supposedly standing across from a barmaid who has a variety of offerings around her, such as champagne, Bass ale, absinthe, oranges, and flowers in a vase. Whereas behind her, we suggest that there is a mirror with a stage and then a trapeze artist with her feet seen in the upper left-hand corner. Whereas off to the right, we seemingly have a reflection of the barmaid and then a man wearing a top hat with a mustache and a goatee. So this we initially assume would be us walking up to and asking this woman for a beverage. However, we find that she seems to look through us vacantly instead of emotionally engaging on a personal level. So we find that in these establishments, very often, the bartenders would also double as prostitutes. And so it is very possible that we could be either asking her for a beverage or her after-hours services. They would often have rooms upstairs. So she seems very disinterested in either of those propositions. Now, the original sketch for the Bar at the Folies Bergère is very telling that Manet is going to leave us behind an example here of his process, which is to confuse the viewer even further about our relationship to the painting. For originally, she had blonde hair, the barmaid did, and her reflection lines up fairly well with her. It actually overlaps her, whereas she looks down and to our right at this man wearing a bowler hat. Now, at this angle, we would be able to see the painting without our head being in the way. Therefore, it more accurately records what a mirror image would actually do. In the final version, you'll notice he moves the reflection far to the right, along with the gentleman who's much taller. Therefore, if we look carefully at the painting, we are unsure. Are we looking at a mirror reflection of ourselves that is just slightly distorted? Or are these two other individuals? We find that critics at the time believed that this was her sister being chatted up by another gentleman behind her. Right? So this is going to be purposeful on the part of Manet, with the awkward cropping, with the strange angles. Even though we have a figure directly in front of us, what is our relationship to her? So this still shows the modern activities and leisurely activities of the bourgeoisie, going out for a night of entertainment at a club, but shows how unsure we are of our relationships with other people. So this is the essence of modernity, this fleeting encounter between these individuals, superficial contact. Are they merely going to exchange goods or services momentarily and never see each other again? Do they have any connection to one another emotionally, financially, or otherwise? We are left unclear on that, just as in life we are unsure of everyone we pass on the streets and those individuals that we engage with. So we find the same thing to be true of Caillebot's Paris, a Rainy Day. What are the relationships of these individuals? Do they know one another? Even the couple that are going to be sharing the same umbrella. Is that his wife, or is that going to be a courtesan? Is it a prostitute? Is it his mistress? We don't know what the relationship of individuals actually are. Thus again, we have the essence of modernity here, the fleeting encounter with someone else in a city, this superficial contact as we just glance at someone and catch their eye, or have a brief conversation and never see them again. This is what is going to be taken up in the Impressionist exhibition that we will discuss in the next lecture in the next class.